BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. And yes, this podcast is pivoting wildly at the moment between the absolute present and the near future and the far and distant past. We have looked in the last German episode at when humans became humans and are no longer large apes. We have looked at how the starry sky has been interpreted in different cultures and which stories civilizations have projected into that starry sky. Perhaps we'll come back to that. And today we come to one of the other great pivots of human existence on this planet. And I'm really thrilled to welcome to the BlomCast Laura Spinney, one of the most exciting and original science writers that we have. And Laura, welcome. And you became very well known for a book with the beautiful title Pale Rider. That became far too topical for most of us when COVID hit because it was a book about the Spanish flu that hit in 1918, and that was much more devastating than the First World War, caused many more dead, as an event that had been sort of forgotten about in history for a long time until you came along.
I'm not quite sure about that, but I gave it a revival, let's say.
A very important revival. And now in this new book, Proto, you look at the origins of language. But let me ask you, before we delve into Proto, your interest always seems to bring together culture and science. It's sort of happening at that intersection. You know, the Spanish flu was, of course, a scientific event, but it was also a huge cultural event. And of course, language, the origins of language, you delve deeply into scientific studies, into scientific modes of understanding and explaining the ways we think. What has forged that interest for you?
I think it's a deep inner frustration that when I was at school and choosing my A-levels, you know, the exams that we did at 18 in the UK, I wasn't allowed to do history and biology, chemistry, and physics. I was forced to choose. So I did biology, chemistry, physics, and maths, and disliked physics and maths quite intensely, and always resented that. I think somehow I'm drawn to that frontier. I can't really explain it, but for me, I think the best I can do is to say that for me, science is a method for getting at the truth. It's imperfect, but that is what it is. And therefore, it can be applied to any question, more or less usefully. And why can't we apply it to the past? Why can't we apply it to questions about where we've come from?
It's interesting because I often make the opposite argument when people ask me why I have made the eccentric choice as an historian to look at the future, essentially, when it comes to what happens to the climate catastrophe, what happens to the future of our democracies, about which I'm not that optimistic. But, and I say, well, as an historian, you learn, it really doesn't matter which battle happened when, or which king was on which throne in which year. What matters is structures. What matters is the energies coursing through a time and to identify them and to identify the structures of power. And you can do that for the Middle Ages, but you can also do that for today. You can use the same perspective to analyze our own present. So perhaps you can also use the scientific perspective, the scientist's perspective, to peer into the past much more than history has done. But it was also, and that becomes very clear in your book, it is also a book that couldn't have been written 20 years ago because the research methods simply weren't there yet.
Right. Yeah. So in this particular story, we're talking about something that has been pieced together with the help of three sciences: linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. And the genetics has really only kicked in the last 10 years. not that genetics obviously didn't exist before that, but it was the ability to extract DNA from ancient human remains and analyze it that became possible then. And the reason that's important to a study of language is that you can now track prehistoric migrants through space and time. That is, before we have any written records of where they were going and why and what they were doing. And we think that migration is if not the main, then at least a major motor of language dispersal. So that's how that feeds into that story.
You tell at the end of your book a story that is really also marks the beginning of your research, or perhaps just a sort of spark in this story. And that begins rather confusingly or rather surprisingly in the Mariupol steelworks. The Mariupol steelworks, famous from Putin's invasion, from the heroic resistance that was in the Azov steelworks, that was led there until the defenders had to surrender. Mariupol, this city, was very badly bombed during that time and almost entirely flattened. And that is, unfortunately, a very important story for the study of prehistory and prehistorical linguistics. Why?
So the tragic irony and the historical parallels of this place were inescapable, I think. So yes, there was a cemetery at Mariupol. I mean, the significance of the place in the longue durée, I suppose, is that it's there at the frontier of the steppe and the forest. This is the frontier which so much happens, including the genesis of new language families. And that frontier has always been. I had the biologist turned historian Peter Turchin describe it as the place of destructive creation. So much happens there. But in the detail, as they were building that steel plant, which became the sort of the place that the Ukrainian troops retreated to, they discovered this ancient cemetery there. And first of all, the very touching detail that the people buried in this communal grave from the late Stone Age, their heads were facing east and west. That really struck me. And so, yeah, it was a mass grave to echo the mass grave that was built not in the same place, but further out towards the outskirts of Mariupol at the time of the siege. And the significance in prehistory is that we think it probably showed the moment, or if we'd been able to extract ancient DNA from that cemetery, we might have been able to detect and when very far-reaching cultural and genetic influences came together to form the people who we think spoke the ancestral language to Indo-European. And we will never know that for sure because the cemetery has gone and the few bones and teeth that could be salvaged from it didn't yield any useful DNA, any readable DNA. But there are other clues that it could have been really informative. So there's that tragedy as well.
But all the archaeological finds were also gone because the museum was destroyed.
The museum was also destroyed in the siege. So yeah, the cemetery was destroyed apart from a few relics back in 1930 when they were building the plant. And some of those graves were salvaged and sent to the local history museum at that point, but the museum was also destroyed in the siege.
It's extraordinary how sometimes you have these historical flashpoints that remain flashpoints throughout history. That's not only true for Ukraine geographically, that has had such an unsettled history. It's also true, for instance, I was thinking, I've been writing something about, well, I've written a book about the curious illusion that human beings can control nature. And that starts in ancient Mesopotamia, and its great monument is the palace of Ashurbanipal, which was in Nineveh, which is today Mosul, one of the most fought-over cities. So you've got these curious continuities. But back to your theme, and you just mentioned it, Proto-Indo-European. We finally arrived. Tell us about this idea. I mean, there are about, I think, 700 languages spoken in the world at the moment.
7,000.
7,000. And they belong to very few families.
They belong to altogether about 140 families, although I have to say they're not particularly well documented. Amazingly, only about 10% of those languages are really well documented. Um, Most of us speak the top 5 families of those, so they're very unevenly distributed. And of those top 5 families, the big behemoths are Indo-European, with its major representative English today, and sino-tibetan, major representative Mandarin. Mandarin has more native speakers than English, but Indo-European has more native speakers than Sino-Tibetan. So these two are battling it out at the top there at the moment.
Now, your story is really the origin story of these languages, these language families, and where they came from. And just a little bit out of left field, I did a podcast with a writer and historian called Raoul Schrott, who has written a wonderful book about the starry skies as seen by different cultures. And one thing that he found that really stunned him was that, of course, cultures project their own societies into the starry sky. But there are some star signs that are so stably interpreted as the same thing in cultures as different as Australian Aboriginals and the inhabitants of the Atlas Mountains in northern Morocco and the cultures of Mesopotamia, who all see the Pleiades as 7 sisters pursued by a hunter in all their different. That he said the only explanation for that is that these stories already came out of Africa with the first migrants and dispersed over the world. That, he said, that was the only thing that... Did it work in a similar way for language, or what happened there?
Oh, it's so fascinating. I mean, there are these very tight parallels between the stories we tell and the words we tell them in, but they don't necessarily travel together. I mean, there is a huge revival, by the way, in that field of trying to understand where our stories come from. Again, as in so many of these things, aided by vast databases of stories, computer algorithms, and new ways of looking at the data. But so the Australian point is interesting because that probably means that yes, they did. I mean, they didn't have much contact with the Atlas Mountains over time. Although, of course, stories can diffuse through people as well. So probably there were some stories that came out of Africa with us 60,000 years ago, which is already mind-boggling. I know that some people think that the dragon and dragon slayer stories, which are fairly universal but very, very present in a certain form in the Indo-European traditions, might have come out of Africa. Some kind of archaic memory of a reptile, of a dangerous reptile, came out with us and flowered in all these ways. That is disputed. And the problem with this whole field is trying to differentiate stories that traveled with people from stories that diffused through peoples, were just borrowed from each other. And of course, the third possibility is convergence. It's just that we're all telling stories about universal themes that kind of concern us all, and therefore we just converge on the same types of stories.
Well, the stability of these stories appears to be remarkable because they're very, very specific, some of these stories. And while some stories clearly tell about different social universes, different natural universes, some of these things seem to have been very stable. But this migration out of Africa, what significance did that have for the origin of the languages that then came to dominate the world, as you described?
Okay, so a very quick sketch of the history of language. The very deep origins of language are somewhat disputed, and you can understand why. We don't have any records. That's all to do with understanding what the brain power was of the first hominids and what the vocal tract was capable of, but very much debated. But I'd say that probably the theory that has an edge at the moment is that we've been speaking since the beginning as Homo sapiens. In fact, there are even those who say that we were skipping for longer than some of the earlier ancestral species. Might have been quite primitive at that time, might have been signed rather than spoken, but anyway, it would be characterized as language. By the time that humans walked out of Africa, and there were a number of sorties from Africa, but the one that really peopled the rest of the world was about 60,000 years ago. We were speaking. We had quite a already sophisticated way of communicating with each other through speech, and we were able to do the fundamental jobs of language, which are talking about the hypothetical, telling stories. And so those people, then spread out all over the world, and they take probably a subset of the rich diversity of sounds and ways of communicating that were present in Africa, which is interesting, because if you think that you're going through this bottleneck basically, and you're just taking a small subset, and then those are flowering again, and stories. And I've forgotten what your question is. Where am I going from here?
Let me just pick you up on that idea on the subset, because that's so interesting. What Rauschott argued was that actually not all African cultures have very elaborate sky mythologies. They have very elaborate mythologies, but they're not strongly related to the sky and what you see in the sky. They may have sun and moon, but not many star signs. And he said, first of all, in the sort of tropical belt, you wouldn't have seen a lot of the starry sky. But he said it is also possible that the people who exited Africa were the cultures that had stories about the starry sky, because that helped them to navigate. So the ones that had started to talk about the starry sky were the ones that could navigate and could make this long migration.
That makes total sense. Yeah. How would we test it? I don't know, but it does make total sense. So the point is that then we go into the long, cold ice age, and we're hunter-gatherers. So small bands of people roaming about the landscape, and it gets really, really, really cold around 20,000 years ago. That's when the glaciers are at their fullest extent across large bits of Eurasia. So people kind of go into these refuges, they follow their prey into these refuges, and they hang out there. Many people die, obviously. But the survivors then come out again when it starts to warm up, 14,000 years ago, roughly. And within a couple of thousand years, they've invented farming in the Fertile Crescent. And farming, of course, can support far bigger populations for the same patch of land. And so you get population growth, and the dialects that those people speak are going to expand into languages, and they're going to split into new dialects as the people spread out. And those dialects, some of them will become languages in their own right. And then you get these families of languages flowering. And that is basically the point in the language story where the big languages families flourish that shape our linguistic landscape today. Not all of them survive, but that's the sort of big threshold moment. And Indo-European is one of them. So Indo-European is one of those things that takes off then. And it turns out to be the most successful. And that is a multi-stage story, but the original speakers probably were very successful themselves. It got a good kickstart, if you like. Those people were nomadic. They were very successfully adapted to their environment, which was the steppe. They spread out, and they carried their languages with them.
Tell me about this moment that you just described, from a dialect to a language. What makes that different? Is it that you have writing and you can fix it, or is it that, as you know, in a settlement, obviously you have division of labor. That's the beginning of culture. And in these early settlements, you have, they discover irrigation, therefore you can have bigger population densities, therefore some people can specialize and no longer need to be in the fields. And that means, also, of course, also that the social universe becomes more complex of these people. Is that a kickoff for language becoming more complex as well, to encapsulate that?
Well, if you think of, so obviously it's a very knotty question at the heart of all of this, the difference between a dialect and a language, and it is heavily political. I mean, there are many cases where you can say, why is that a dialect and that's a language? It doesn't make any sense. And of course, there's the famous witticism of Max Weinrich, I think it was, who said, a Hebrew linguist who said, a dialect is a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So there is that at the heart of it, this political dimension. So you have to be a bit wary about these things. But essentially, before nations and borders and national languages, the linguistic landscape would have looked quite different. It would have looked like chains of dialects spreading out across space, where each village would understand the dialect of the one next door, but the villages at the ends of the chain wouldn't necessarily understand each other. So that's what it would have looked like. And in a way, it still looks like that. If you think about, I don't know, if you're traveling across Germany, you would have the same effect.
It's very interesting in Austria. Because on the one hand, your story of a language being a dialect with a navy and an army, Austrian could have easily become its own language, I believe. It's got elements of its own grammar. It's got its own subjunctive, as opposed to Northern German. There were things that linguists could have built on. But in the 19th century, nationalist linguists or nationalist intellectuals in Austria looked towards Germany, and therefore had no interest in establishing a separate language.
So there's a huge geopolitical dimension to this, but the geopolitics is built on the geography.
If they had formalized the dialect and given it a grammar and taught it in school, it would have become a language. But the other thing is, of course, Austria is really, well, we know how it came into being, and it was never meant to be what it is now. And it is this sort of curious conglomerate of the East that is basically belongs to the Slavic cultures, and the West, which is Alpine and really much more South German in many parts. And then, of course, there are other nationalities. And in the Alpine regions, of course, you also have the fact that people in different valleys speak completely different dialects that are mutually. So there the chain is broken by mountains.
Yes, I mean, so the geopolitics is shaped by the geography, and the geopolitics shapes the languages, and you probably, it eventually comes full circle. I remember the valley effect from when I lived in Switzerland. But so yeah, I think it helps to bear in mind this idea always that language is a tool, and language helps us adapt to our environment. Therefore, it's natural that it varies over space. And from the sort of creation of the nation states, you have the imposition on top of those dialect chains of borders, national languages. And that's what we see today. But underneath them, there are still these dialect chains. They're still there. Of course, there were massive efforts in recent centuries to suppress some of the regional languages and dialects, and that's left its mark as well. But yeah, both things are going on. So when we look back at prehistory, before writing, before borders, before literacy and technology, of course, we're looking at a linguistic landscape that has some of the features of what we have today, but not all of them. It's very different in many ways. And this language, Proto-Indo-European, of course, nobody who spoke it called it that. We call it that because we're looking back at what we think is the last common ancestor of this family. It's a hypothetical language. We can't prove it existed.
It would be in itself a dialect chain.
It would be definitely a cluster of dialects. And in fact, one of the ideas is that as these nomads spread out carrying it, the people who left heading eastwards towards China and India took a different set of dialects from the ones who went to the west towards Europe. So it's a similar idea to what we were discussing earlier with the ones who came out of Africa, only taking a subset each time. Okay. Yeah, so the dialect concept is important, and probably when we talk about Proto-Indo-European, we're talking about a cluster of dialects. And since we can't be very precise about what that language was, its nature, its lexicon, and so on, we're maybe even looking at a cluster of dialects spread out over time, maybe spoken by several cultures who succeeded each other in a relatively short space of time.
You say we don't have a dictionary for it, but what do we know about this language, Proto-Indo-European, which predates Indo-European languages, but not only Indo-European languages?
Well, we do actually know surprisingly a lot about it. So we do have a dictionary for it, although it's fairly slim. So first of all, I suppose we have to answer the question of how we can know anything about it since it wasn't written down and it's been dead for more than 4,000 years. But the sort of answer to that is that we compare the living Indo-European languages, and not only the living ones, but also the dead ones that we have textual evidence for. So, for example, Sanskrit, Ancient Greek, Latin. And we can compare those, and we can find, for example, a word that is clearly related across all those languages, and we can look at all the variations in that word. And because we are in our communication restrained both by our cognition and by our vocal tracts, there are actually quite clear rules about how sounds evolve over time. And so by comparing the way that these words have diverged through the different branches of the family, linguists can reconstruct what the ancestral form was. And so they've done that in terms of the lexicon, the vocabulary. So a language consists essentially of the sounds, the grammar, and the lexicon. There are some other aspects to it as well, which I get criticized by linguists for leaving out, but I'm trying not to be too technical here. Those are the three main components. And if you're talking about the vocabulary, the linguists have reconstructed a body of about 1,600 words. Technically, strictly speaking, they're stems rather than words, so that you could add endings on and massage them with the rules of grammar, and you'll get a bigger number of words. But those already are quite informative about where the language was spoken, when it was spoken, and who might have spoken it. And that's where we can start cross-referencing with the archaeology and the genetics to try and work out who the speakers were.
So how does that work, pinpointing when a language was spoken somewhere, if you just have bones in the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, this is controversial, but there are different ways of getting at that question. So first of all, the rate of divergence of this Indo-European family suggests a certain bracket in past time when the original language was spoken, to explain how it can have diverged this much, but not more and not less by this point in history. It's very much an inexact science. For example, linguists tend to have a rule of thumb that a language takes between 500 and 1,000 years to turn into a new language, to become unintelligible to its original speakers. But that's really, really a very rough rule of thumb. I mean, if historical events are very turbulent for a period, then the language will adapt and change more quickly. If you go through a long period of calm, it will tend to change less fast. So, but roughly speaking, people place the origins of this family between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. And then you can ask, well, what were the major cultural transformations of Europe and Asia in that time span? Because it's fairly accepted that to have a complete turnover in the linguistic landscape, you must have been other things going on. Like, that doesn't happen on its own. You've either got a huge wave of migration, or you've got some massive cultural change like the farming revolution. The language have to piggyback on something else. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So that's one way of getting at it. And then there's the linguistic evidence itself, because languages are constantly evolving and changing. You have clues within the language, within the deeper layers of the language, as to where it came from and what kind of world it reflected.
Just to make this clear for our listeners, Proto-Indo-European, is that related, you said, to the Tibeto-Chinese languages? Is there a common origin of these two, or there's two different language families that have come out of Africa and evolved separately? Are there ancestors, are there communalities between them?
So if you go back far enough, all languages share a common ancestor, right? Probably at the beginning, there was an original chain of dialects, and some of those went off and some of them died, and some of them came out of Africa and seeded the others. Many, many, many died. There's been an estimate that 500,000, 500,000 languages might have been spoken in the history of humanity, which, when you think we've only got 7,000 today and they're dwindling fast, is quite a thought. The vast majority of them, of course, never recorded. But Sino-Tibetan would have been probably one of those other families that flowered after the Neolithic Revolution in a different part of the world, with a different common ancestor at that point. One of the difficulties of studying these languages is that we can't go back very far in time. The sort of rule of thumb, again, is that you can't go back beyond 10,000 years, because basically the tools that linguists have for detecting the forces that have shaped a language stop working at that point. So if you could go back beyond 10,000 years, you'd probably eventually get to the common ancestor of Sino-Tibetan and Indo-European. But because we can't, we're looking in the period where they're already separate families. But essentially, probably, and Sino-Tibetan, there is no other language family that's as well studied as Indo-European. Indo-European, in a way, has been the model for how to and how not to study language. It's the one that the linguists cut their teeth on. So Sino-Tibetan is relatively less studied. That's changing right now. But it was probably also a family that owes its initial spread to farming. Neolithic revolution in that part of the world. And of course, it will have been shaped by completely different historical forces, completely different migrations, climate events, technologies, social changes. And it will tell its own story, which will be no less fascinating. There's no doubt about that.
This own story, you mentioned nationalism earlier, and the study of languages has always also been a sort of study and projection of origin myths. Every nation must not only have the noblest language, but it must be very pure language that goes back to a great civilization.
And the first, ours was the first.
And the first, of course. But what is the story that science is beginning to elaborate as an answer to that?
Well, it's very interesting because there are those. I'm thinking of Jean-Paul Demoule, who's a very eminent archaeologist here in France, who has always taken the sort of devil's advocate position and reminded us that it's dangerous to think about single origins, and it's basically a hangover from the Bible. And you know, we already discussed how probably it wasn't a single language spoken in a single place, but a dialect chain. And that languages fell onto the landscape differently in prehistory. So he's always reminding us to be very wary of the idea of a single birthplace and a single cradle. And I think he's right.
But we see that in other primates. We know that chimpanzee groups have their dialects, and when an individual joins that group, they have to learn the dialect. They have to learn the sounds and the gestures that mean a different thing in this group. And if they want to refer something, they have to learn that language. So obviously, at least since there were primates, there have been systems of communication, a kind of language, a non-verbal language that functioned in dialect chains.
Yeah. So I think the broad thrust is correct. We're on the right track. But I think he's right to remind us that, okay, we're talking about a hypothetical language, never written down, no evidence it actually existed, no direct evidence. Probably a dialect chain spread out over space. We can't even be sure it was spoken by the same people at the same time. So I think he's just right to inject that little bit of uncertainty at the beginning. But of course, people have always loved this idea of the beginning, the origin, the start of everything. And it has unfortunately been very tightly entwined with nationalist ideologies from the beginning of the study of the Indo-European languages. And so the sort of beginning of modern linguistics, if you like, in the late 18th century. And, it's had its phases. The British Empire made use of its story to justify its expansion. The Nazis did the same. At the moment, it's very popular in India amongst Hindu nationalists who claim that the origin of the whole Indo-European family was there in northwest India. This is the out of India theory, that Sanskrit's the oldest, probably the original. Everything else found out from there. Not much evidence for that, but that doesn't seem to matter. So yeah, it has always been distorted and will always be distorted, I'm sure. But I mean, what can we do about that? All we can do is carry on with the science and try and fill in the gaps in an evidence-based way. So I think that becomes important. By the way, language has already been also been harnessed in this Ukraine-Russia war. It's in Mr. Putin's famous essay that he published online in 2021, I think.
Still worth reading.
Still worth reading. His version of history and his ideas about, which don't start with him, by the way, but about the limits of the Russophone sphere and the responsibility of the Russian state towards all Russian speakers in Eastern Europe.
Let's just come back. I've got a few more questions for you, but let's just round off the story of the Indo-European languages and their biography, really. Beginning in Europe and then spreading out over the world. What marked that story? You say we can go back 5,000 years and we see these families emerging, we see them delineated. What marks that story, especially, as you say, also natural events, historical events? What determines the biography of a language?
I mean, it's very heavily determined by migration. Certainly in prehistory. Of course, if you think about the modern world, the way that our languages move and mingle and spread out and contract is shaped by some new forces that weren't present in prehistory, like literacy, like nation states, languages of administration, like the internet, and books. But it was mainly migration in the past. I think that's the consensus. And migration was very often driven by climate events. So, there's, for example, I mean, there are many climate events which puncture this story and which shape the flowering of the family. But the one that is perhaps most interesting is that you get a movement into Europe out of the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas. That movement is the movement that probably brings the forerunners of the Germanic languages in which we're speaking now, the Italic languages, Celtic languages, Baltic, Slavic, and so on. There's a slightly different story.
And that all goes through Ukraine, through what's today Ukraine.
Absolutely, yeah. But some point there's a drought, essentially, a cold spell and a drought in Europe, and part of those, well, the descendants by now of those people, we're talking about sort of 2,200 BC, and later, so over 4,000 years ago. Some of the descendants of those original migrants who went west to turn around and go back to the steppe. And the thinking at the moment is that back migration is the one that fuels Baltic and Slavic to the north, and that goes on peeling off southwards towards the subcontinent and is the origin of the Indo-Iranian languages. And this explains some very interesting parallels between those two branches. So, for example, the words we were talking about stars, the Gemini constellation is the same word almost in Lithuanian and in Sanskrit, and has the same connotations of horse, of equine twins, or horse riding twins.
So another stable star sign that we see, another stable image in the star. Tell me, what difference does writing make to a language? Obviously it stabilizes the language. Obviously you can read what your ancestors thought and you can transmit thoughts into the future. But for the development of the language itself, is it a conserving force? Is it a conservative agent? Or does it also accelerate the creativity of the language?
No, I think it decelerates it, and it slows down language change. And you can see that even today, some of the sort of, let's say, countercultural elements that inevitably always come into the mainstream culture eventually, but they're coming from languages that are at the margins and that originally are more spoken than written. So I'm thinking of some sort of African American music cultures, that eventually get sucked up into the mainstream, but that start on the margins and tend to be more spoken. There is more creativity there. And often, many of the most interesting novelists and writers come from those traditions where there's more looseness around the language and the creativity can leak in. So there is a yet another rule of thumb. There's a lot of rules of thumb in this story. That means it doesn't always hold, but it holds as a rule that language evolution would have been faster before the creation of states with borders and of writing. And interestingly, this is an impact on the way that English, for example, is changing today. So many people, English is sort of flowering into these many variants, and you can already see, that sometimes speakers of these different variants of English can't understand each other. It has happened that, on different TV stations, you've got English from one part of the world being subtitled in the local form of English because otherwise the locals can't understand it. So the question naturally arises: is English going to do what Latin once did and just sort of explode in a starburst of Romance languages? And the thinking from the linguists, at least the ones that I've spoken to, is that no, it won't do that, because even though the spoken forms are diverging, we all have this shared written form.
So it goes more the way of Arabic, in fact, where you have one written high language that's used for the news and in books, and then you have, a Moroccan has no chance of understanding a Syrian in their day-to-day street language.
Right. Whereas if you think about the Roman Empire at its peak, most people are illiterate. The person at one end of the empire would not have understood the person at the other, and there was nothing holding them together like a shared written language. So yeah, so that's one way in which the writing is constraining the evolution of language today that it didn't in prehistory.
Tell me, if we think about language and its development with culture and through culture, we come inevitably to that old chestnut that is still such a fascinating question, namely, in which way language also frames and shapes thought, and perhaps more than thought, even feelings. I mean, we all know that if you speak a foreign language, you live in France. If you speak a foreign language, you can express different aspects of yourself. You have words for different things. And yes, you can also think in a different way. I would argue that the thinking style of French and English, for instance, is very different. The French, is performative very often and lives through paradoxes and amazing effects, but is actually, in its argument, repetitive in structure. You make the argument several times. In, a classic British way of thinking, you think very much in sort of ABC, logical progression and strong structure. And these things are not just things that are taught at school, they're also, what do you think about this connection between the language, the world a language allows you to articulate, and therefore also gives you words for thinking in, and how far does language imprint your perception, your being in the world?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and I would highly recommend a book on this by a linguist at Cambridge called Guy Deutscher, called Through the Looking Glass. And I think that's the title, something like that, with looking glass in it. So first of all, I have to totally agree with you about the French thinking differently, and of course these differences are real and global. The other day I was talking to a person I would describe as an intellectual who compared the Anglo-Saxon and the he was talking about the French way of thought, which he described as academic, versus the Anglo-Saxon. Okay, so Anglo-Saxon is not academic. But what he meant, and he explained, was that the Anglo-Saxon way is we argue through cases, through examples, and the academic, by which he meant French, of course, is conceptual, talking in concepts. So yes, those differences are definitely real, and often very troubling, aren't they? They kind of get in the way.
But also fascinating. I remember I just wrote a little book about hope and whether there is any. And, I looked at other languages, of course. And, Indo-European is pretty solid, although with a very strong religious beginning of this concept, because it means that you have to have the idea of a changing future in order to hope for something in the future. But then I found, speaking to a Chinese expert, that there was actually, in classical Chinese, there was no word for what we call hope. There is an expectation of positive things that might happen, but there is no concept that is that charged as the word hope we have. So, yes, I do think this is a fascinating relationship between how we can think the world and the language we use to think it.
Totally fascinating. And those, and each of these concepts, as you obviously acknowledge in your book, is a history in itself, because they're reflecting the tradition of that culture and how it evolved. So the point of Guy Deutscher's book, which is truly fascinating, is that they're all sort of Sapir-Whorf theories about, language really blocking out whole parts of the universe, and you can only see this bit with your one language, which is different, completely different from what person speaking a different language see. That's all been thrown away. We don't believe that anymore. Basically, we all have the same cognitive structure. We see the same world. We have the same problems to deal with. So the broad parameters are the same for all of us, but that language can subtly steer you to pay attention to certain aspects of the universe rather than others, definitely. And that's almost where the sort of most interesting aspects are, especially as we are so globalized now, we're so interconnected, because you come across them all the time. You're constantly meeting them in people who come from other cultures, and they are reflected in the words, as you say, with the word for hope. And again, in the stories we tell. So one of the examples I give in my book is that in the Indo-European tellings of the sort of dragon slayer myth, there's a very tight connection between snakes and milk. The idea was that the snake is stealing your milk. And if you think about the original speakers of Indo-European, they were herders. They had cows, goats, and sheep, and their diets were heavily milk-based. That's what they survived on. So milk was a crucial thing. Cows were a crucial thing to them. And the serpent, which in so many cultures is the sort of negator, the denier of life, is going to steal the thing that helps you survive, so milk. So there's this concept, and it's even there in for example, the Sanskrit word, which I warn you, I'm sure mispronounced, goda, which is a word meaning a reptile, actually means I think something like stealing of milk or taking of milk.
Is that, by the way, attested anywhere that snakes steal milk from cows?
Snakes do not steal milk. They can't suck, because there's this concept of the snake sort of nestling in with the calves, to drink the milk a bit like a cuckoo. They can't suck, and they can't digest cow's milk, mammalian milk. So no, there's absolutely no scientific grounding for it, but it's there in the words, it's there in the stories, it's there cocooned in our Indo-European psyche.
Well, this Indo-European psyche, I mean, I do think these things are really fascinating, because they also get us closer to how we think about ourselves, how we conceive of our personal and our social universe. And I do think it's something that we don't often pay enough attention to, how these words come with a heavy baggage, come with their own color.
Yeah, and they are our culture, and they are our tradition, and they're our identity in many ways. They're what links us, but sometimes they're just wrong. And that's okay. That's not a problem until it is, until you insist that your ideology and your way of looking at the universe is somehow right and better than other people's.
Revealed by God, and therefore the only true one that can show you the world as it really is.
Exactly.
This look at the development of language in a world where we today have the feeling that our languages are fragmenting at a very increased rate through social media, through technological acceleration. What did you learn that you did not expect to learn from your very intense look at how we speak, why we speak, and how that developed?
I mean, I suppose the broad overarching lesson is how dynamic and malleable language is, and how responsive it is to the environment. And in fact, not really so much language as speakers. I mean, if you extinguish a population of speakers, you extinguish, and they're the only speakers of that language, then the language goes. And that has happened many times through history. In fact, when I was writing my book about the so-called Spanish flu, when that flu reached Vanuatu in the Pacific, which was, and I believe still is, one of the most linguistically diverse places on earth, it knocked out, because it was so deadly to those people who didn't have immunity to that flu. It knocked out a large number of people and languages. So, languages change, they reflect the state of the world, and many, many different things that shape the world. And I suppose, you as a historian who looks forward, that's what I try to do at the end of my book as well, is that they haven't stopped changing. They're still changing. It's true that writing and literacy have slowed things down, but other factors are probably speeding up. Migration. Will we have a migration crisis in the wake of the climate crisis? That's a debate. But people are moving. They're moving around the world as they always have. I mean, my understanding is that the levels of international migration have basically been fairly stable since about 1960. The directions are changing because of the climate crisis, which is interesting. But those things will have an effect on the linguistic landscape. And also, I think about, you hear a lot about erosion, and that's a real effect. These 7,000 languages are probably not even 7,000 anymore. There's probably fewer than that, and they are dying at a rather alarming rate. But I think there are interesting things going on. For example, on the internet, new variants coming up, new dialects. Will they turn into languages in their own right? We'll have to wait and see. But also, there's this new concept that linguists have been talking about for a couple of decades now called multi-ethnolets. And these are things that arise, for example, in inner cities where the children of immigrants from different parts of the world are meeting and, socializing, going to school together, and they're merging their different vocabularies and elements of their languages with, for example, the German that is the national language in the city and the country they find themselves, or English or wherever, and these multi-ethnolects are arising. Now, those tend to be marginalized and stigmatized because it's immigrants who are speaking them and because they're, poor inner city areas in general. But if circumstances were to change and that were to take off, or through, the subcultures, the countercultures that we were discussing, through rap, that's a hugely influential way in which languages change. They could have their effect. So I feel a little bit, I'm not a linguist, so I'm not an expert, but I feel like there are sources of optimism for if you're interested in linguistic diversity that we may not have taken seriously enough yet, while not at all belittling the problem of erosion that's happening. There are those who say we'll end up all speaking English. But as we know, English or Globish.
I think English is fracturing in so many directions that will be its own multitude. But let me just take you back to my good old friend Denis Diderot in the 18th century. He writes a little story called Supplément Voyage de Bougainville, in which he describes essentially the discovery of Tahiti by the French, or discovery in heavy quotation marks, which was a real story, and the French met a different civilization. And indeed, Bougainville, the explorer, persuaded one of the islanders to come back with him to France. And this is for once not a nasty story of exploitation, because he was duly deposited back in his place, in his culture, a few years later. And Diderot imagines meeting this man and asking him, what will you tell your people about what you saw in our country? And this man answers, very little, because they wouldn't have the words to understand me and they would think I'm mad. And then you think, yes, how do you describe to a culture that doesn't know the wheel and doesn't know horses how you get about in a horse and coach in France? You're describing dragons and dragon slayers, you're describing mythological beasts, you're describing legendary things for which the language simply has no words because it didn't have to. And languages need to also adapt their vocabulary to a new reality. And we often find that personally or as cultures, we hit a new reality for which we feel very strongly. We don't have the words yet to express it, to think about it, to make it an object of our thought. I think one of the very big stories at the moment, perhaps the biggest, perhaps bigger than the climate crisis, is technological acceleration. At a rate faster than our cultures can assimilate, understand, integrate into their cultures. What do you think will that story do with the development of language?
It's true that we're in a sort of unprecedented place in history. So who really knows? It could affect language in so many different ways. One possible thing that people are talking about a lot is the fact that, I mentioned that there's a lot of migration, always has been, might speed up with the climate crisis, though we haven't really seen it yet. But then, so immigrants arrive in a new place, and historically for, all time, they've essentially assimilated, unless they come and they're numerically or technologically superior, in which they've imposed their own language. Yeah. But there has been this sort of communing on the linguistic level. And if we have AIs where you just hold out your phone and whatever you say, it translates it in real time to the person you're talking to, there will be no need to learn that other language. So
what a devastating loss that is.
Will it be, though? Will it be?
I would argue absolutely, because the richness that you have by living in France and having a second language to live in, to understand the world through, will be eliminated, because you can go directly to the result of the translated sentence. You no longer have to know French.
Well, okay, I agree with you on the fundamental thing that the diversity is good, and each language is its own system of knowledge, and it would be tragic to lose those.
It's also its own wealth of experience.
Oh, surely. What I'm saying is, though, it also the immigrants don't have to give up their language if there's technology. So maybe it would encourage diversity.
But I mean, look, I mean, there's people in, I don't know, northern India who daily speak 4 or 5 languages. And that is quite normal to them, and they find it very puzzling that people find it difficult to acquire a second language. I think linguistic environments are very diverse, but to come back to this idea of automation, the other very grave risk seems to me that if you're only trusting on the result because you no longer have to acquire the competence, which is laborsome, how do you know what the result is? You lose the competence to judge the result of this process. You are forced to trust blindly what this thing gives you.
You subcontract it out, that's for sure. But if you think about how so many small languages are succumbing to, for example, English or the great big other, so-called killer languages in the world now. If you didn't have to give up your local language, but only used the sort of dominant language in your encounters with the bureaucracy or whatever, maybe that would preserve the smaller ones for longer. It's difficult to say, really. There are so many different effects going on here. But and also, I think, this thing about saving languages, I go back to my fundamental point about languages at all. This idea about sort of trying to save languages without really, truly, fundamentally understanding why people give them up, I think has been a mistake, which is only now gradually being corrected. Why should people have to speak a language which is not going to take them anywhere in life, which is not going to open doors for them? It's understandable. People, learning a language is not an easy thing to do. So people will only do it if it's useful for them. So there's that aspect of it. On the other hand, preserving languages, I think, is worthwhile because they are systems of knowledge, and we can learn so much from them.
I think it's a little bit like the world's genome. I mean, every plant has a unique genome that has unique qualities that we may not even have explored. I think that it may be very similar for languages.
Right. And so I was speaking to an Australian linguist recently called Nicholas Evans, who's a great expert on the indigenous Australian languages, and he'll tell you, that there are thousands of words in the different indigenous languages for this plant or that animal, which the English-speaking Australians, the kind of fruits of the colonization, don't have. Their language is so much more impoverished in those domains. Which so losing those languages is clearly a loss, along with all the knowledge about what those plants and animals can do and medicinal properties and so on. So yeah, preserving is one thing. Keeping alive without an understanding of what use a language has for someone is a different question in my mind.
Just a last question again, just quickly. The acceleration of the digital world and the development of language, how does that go together? Give us its sketch of the next 10 or 20 years.
Oh goodness, I don't know. Even the experts don't dare to prognosticate, the ones I've spoken to. Seriously, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but it could go either way. For example, it could, accelerate the dominance of English, if that is the dominant language of the web. Of course, it isn't the only language of the web, but it is the dominant one. But it could also be a place where, in the same way that sort of conspiracy theories flourish in dark corners of the web, smaller languages could flourish in dark corners of the web. If we're just moving our existence online, why is it not at least theoretically possible that we could have the diversity we've seen in the past in the physical world, in the digital world? I think that's the hopeful view as far as languages are concerned. Of course, we'd rather there weren't so many conspiracy theories, but if we're talking about languages, it would be good if smaller ones could flourish. And I'm also talking about new smaller ones. Maybe new ones will emerge that are better adapted to this new digital landscape.
I mean, new ones already are emerging. And again, a question: if people tend to interact with very short texts, does that change anything to people who tend to interact with very long text? Does that change the way you use language, or language displays the world for you?
Surely. I mean, emojis, right?
You have to explain subtext constantly.
Yeah, yes, you do. And yet emojis give us I use emojis, I don't know about you, but there's sometimes when they are just the right thing for the moment and a shorthand that is incredibly useful. So I have nothing against them. But yes, you do have to sometimes, and you have to be aware of cultural misunderstandings, but that's always true, isn't it, with language? So, yeah, I don't know. There will surely be things that are lost. We've been talking, this conversation has been punctured by the constellations, by the stars, in prehistory in the steppe, those speakers of Proto-Indo-European looked up at the sky and saw the stars, and they had a word for it, and they undoubtedly told stories about those stars because the same word has come down through the Indo-European branches. Isteri in Sogdian, spoken on the Silk Roads in the Far East, Stjarnia in Icelandic, Aster for Odysseus on his way home. So the same word in these very spaced out branches. So everybody is looking at the stars and imagining what those sparkling things are and coming up with stories about them. Uh, we won't be doing that, presumably, if we're all looking at our computer screens. But maybe there'll be other things that we'll be looking at and wondering about and taking millennia to understand properly.
I have a feeling that our analog assistants, or at least I hope it will remain irreplaceable. Quick last question, what can we look forward to from you next? What are you working on? What are you interested in now?
Well, I'm still rather intrigued by language. I don't know where I'm going next, but I feel drawn in still to language. I'll tell you why, because a linguist I was speaking to who's interested in the Papuan languages said in a sort of throwaway remark, it's the last real opportunity for discovery because there are these whole languages that aren't yet documented, and you can go into the language and get the history of that people that's never been written, understand the worlds that they have moved through in their evolution in a way that real discoverers, real explorers never did for various reasons in historical times. So I find that idea absolutely fascinating.
Okay, well, we'll be interested to see what comes out of that, and perhaps we have a chance to talk about it again. Laura, thank you so much for giving me your time and for talking about your book. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip.
And thank you for listening to the BlomCast and indeed being very patient because, yes, there's a building site outside there ripping up the street. And I still wanted to talk to Laura because, well, you heard how fascinating it was. So stick with us, wait for the next episode. I'm looking forward to engaging with you again and indeed tell all your friends and favorite enemies about the BlomCast. Laura, thank you so much and goodbye to you all.